because of a lot of the rhetoric that we've gotten through our education system, through entertainment, through the press, in this very pervasive way, in this kind of changing of the hegemony, white people have been in a state of flight. Now they're entering into a state of fight, where they're beginning to push back, where they're no longer tolerating this kind of, you have to sit down and shut up because I'm black. I'm the oppressed one in the room. Therefore, you have to listen to me. A lot of whites are beginning to say, well, not so fast, and they're not tolerating anymore.
Over the years, I have been asked what I have against social justice. While I have numerous answers to this, perhaps the most important is this. Social justice is fundamentally an expression of unbelief in the justice of God. It assumes an atheistic framework where God is either not there or does not care. It assumes life is a power play of different groups vying for deity. It is less concerned with matters of right and wrong, and more about who has the power. Critical race theory, as a tenet of critical social justice theory, is a revolutionary ideology that views black people as inferior to white people based on selective evils in history and current social disparities. This ideology uses racism as a weapon to achieve its revolution, which ultimately idolizes power. This unbelief in the justice of God is the occasion for anarchy, restlessness, and persistent bitterness. When social justice, which is a Marxist framework, is believed and adopted, Yahweh and Christianity must be denied. The two cannot coexist. To be a so-called black conservative is often framed as selling out. It is antithetical to the shallow groupthink that suggests that to be black is always to be a victim. Nothing threatens this narrative more effectively than men who assume responsibility for themselves, their families, and their communities, those who refuse to view themselves as perpetual victims. Another layer to this is worth addressing. Proponents of social justice ideology tend to make friends out of fiends. Wherever postmodern thought has been adopted, there is a tendency to overlook and hide the grave failings of so-called freedom fighters. There's something to be said about the quality of a culture and the heroes it upholds. In Africa, power-hungry men who resisted white colonial rule have long been upheld as freedom fighters, even though so many of them ruined their respective countries with their dictatorial communism. And yet, these men continue to be celebrated. The same is true in the United States, where men with compromised characters are upheld as paragons of virtue. Perhaps none is more popular in this regard than Martin Luther King Jr., a supposed proponent of freedom, but enslaved to his lusts, who preached various falsehoods in pulpits, and whose philosophical leanings were rooted in Marxism and communism. Some of Africa's tyrants applauded and befriended MLK Jr. because of a shared vision and camaraderie. And I think that is problematic. My guest today is a bold and unapologetic voice that has dashed the polite sensibilities of those who believe in lies. Chad Jackson is a Dallas-based entrepreneur and researcher who starred in the hit 2020 film Uncle Tom and the subsequent 2022 film Uncle Tom 2. Chad is a frequent contributor to podcasts, radio shows, news programs, and the Uncle Tom YouTube channel, making the case for moral Christian ethics, family values, independence, and intentional citizenship. His most recent undertaking is the MLK Project, which is an incisive film that exposes the true doctrine and dogma of Martin Luther King Jr. I am honored to be joined by him today. Well, Chad, thank you for joining me on In Flames and Crowns. I kid you not, when I was coming up with a list of people I wanted to spend time with and talk to, you were literally on that list.
Oh, wow.
But it was kind of a wish list at the time.
Yeah.
You know, so it was like, well, I'd love to talk to this guy. I just don't know if I'll actually be able to do it. So when I heard that you were going to be in town, I was like, wow, this is so providential. So
what an honor.
This means a lot to me.
Thank you.
I've appreciated your work over the years in speaking against social justice. It felt like you were one of those voices that was really strong. You did it you've done it in a very compelling way, very eloquent, and in a way that I think has sought to correct historical revisionism that has really plagued the way people think about things, right? And you try to set the record straight. Yeah. So I just want to commend you for your work and thank you for everything that you've done over the years.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So what got you into this? Like, what was your interest in tackling things like social justice and everything that you do?
Well, having grown up in the church and really beginning to take my faith seriously shortly after high school, I was one of those believers who wore my faith on my sleeve, right, and wanted the world to know about the gospel. And what was interesting is I noticed a lot of faux gospels, of counterfeit gospels that sought to, in a sense, distract people and to lead people astray. And so for me, it became a kind of crusade to expose those counterfeit gospels, right, and point people to the true gospel is really what it boils down to. Right. In high school, I began to take notice of things like cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci, right, and really began to understand that there's something at work here that is, in a sense, infiltrating and subverting our country, right, and leading multitudes of Americans astray. And I liken it to, like, we live under a kind of milieu here in the States and here in the West in general, where it's very much the hegemony of what we are. But we think that it's neutral. We think that it is, a kind of utopia in its own right. Yeah. Whereas we criticize places like the Middle East, where Islam reigns, and we think that we have more freedom and that this is the way it ought to be. And that's thanks to kind of our understanding of the Enlightenment era and all of the progressive, right, kind of things that have happened here in the West. And we think that we have it so great. But I would argue that what we're dealing with is actually more potent, because while Islam and other religions are easy to point out and say, like, this is why that's bad, in a place like the West, where you have freedom of speech and you have all the things, right, the kind of the detrimental impacts of it, I think, are much more deadly. Yeah. Because it reins in all kind of hollow and deceptive philosophies under the guise of neutrality, under the guise of live and let live. Right. And so we are just as plagued by a hollow and deceptive philosophy here in the West as those who live in like a Middle Eastern, right, Islamic country. Yeah. So anyway,
yeah, and there's a sense in which that's even more sinister, right, because it's disarming. Mm-hmm. That neutral ground postures as being tolerant of everything, but that's the gateway for all kinds of compromise.
Absolutely.
With Islamic countries, you kind of know what you're getting straight up, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what I've seen is just this dangerous trickle over time. I think one way I see it as well is the things that people fought for in World War II, and even before then, there was a real concern with something like socialism or communism in the Western world. Mm-hmm. And today, it's just, that seems to be the order of the day.
Right, we embrace it.
Exactly, we've embraced it. To be against socialism actually seems to be against the grain today, and I think that's what makes it the Trojan horse that it is.
So much so that even in the most recent CNN hit piece that, right, they attempted to do, right, on Moscow and, yeah, Doug Wilson.
Which was fun, by the way.
But what, yeah, was interesting, because I was paying attention to the language that the reporter was, yes, using, and they were talking as if it's common knowledge that the spread of Christianity is bad. Right. Here you have Doug Wilson, they were saying, who wants to spread Christianity in the town and in the state and in the country and in the world. And they were speaking as though they have a kind of a pulse on society, yeah, that everyone just knows that the spread of Christianity is bad. Yeah. And we have to be tolerant nation and a tolerant country that allows people to believe what they want to believe, do what they want to do, live and let live. And so I think that is very telling. I think that's very telling.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where all kind of what goes. So actually, speaking of the CNN interview, my feature in it was like 15 seconds long. But I think the entire interview was about 40 minutes long. And what I'd actually spent the majority of the time talking about was the influence of Christianity in the West in comparison to nations that have not been influenced by Christianity. The differences are actually quite stark. I believe that Christianity has the exclusive when it comes to freedom and prosperity. And nations that have not had Christianity aren't really free and struggle with prosperity, right? In a very fundamental way. And I think the lie of neutrality is that those things, freedom and flourishing, can exist in this sort of neutral space, right? As long as we can all get along to some degree, we can all flourish. But that's a lie. History tells us quite the opposite, that never works. As Doug often likes to say, it's really Christ or chaos. And to now assert that Christianity is the truth and that it has the exclusive on freedom and flourishing, people find that very controversial.
100%.
Yeah. So I think CNN conveniently left that out because it's also really inconvenient for a black guy from Africa to be saying those kinds of things. You know?
Yeah, and it's also too predicated on, I think, years of what the press has been doing, what the media has been doing in terms of assisting in the spread of this notion or this ideology that progress means pushing a kind of what's the word? There's a word. Anyway, the word escapes me. But anyway, it's this kind of humanist. There you go. Like humanism is kind of the most moral virtue that a society can adopt. And humanism, in a humanist society, there is no one religion that is supposed to, in a sense, rise above the others. That you're free to believe in whatever superstition that you want to believe in, but don't ever try to spread your superstitions to others, because to the extent that you do so, that's when we lose society. That's when we lose progress. That's when we lose a kind of moral society, quite frankly. And so they carry on as if they do have the moral high ground, but it's chaos. I mean, and we see the fruits of it here and now. Whether we're talking about LGBT, whether we're talking about the trans thing, whether we're talking about the fractured race issue that's going on, we can point to a bevy of different things where, and not only that, to take it a little deeper, when you look at the mental health of society, that's one of the things that they like to harp on, mental health.
Exactly.
We're not doing better than our fathers and grandfathers when it comes to our mental health. When it comes to, I mean, I'm one to talk, but when it comes to, obesity and all sorts of things, depression and suicide, we're not doing so great in all of these departments. And so we've given their way of thinking a try. We've given them a go. So much so that the church in the West has, in a sense, yielded the ground in many respects, so as to not offend, so as to not be disrespectful. So, so we've kind of retreated. But what I'm grateful to see is that there are more voices,
speaking
up, whether it be your Doug Wilsons or your Jeff Durbins or others who are being bold with the gospel. And I think we need to see more of that because, I mean, Wilson is right, that you either have Christ or chaos. And I think for many people, when you hear the word chaos, they think of open violence in the streets and all the things. So we have a perception of chaos, but the reality of it is we're seeing a kind of quiet chaos, or a chaos that is, in a sense, masked or made light of by the press. I mean, I think of, and
you say masked and I chuckle and it's like, well, quite literally a few years ago.
Right. But in 2020,
Yeah.
where literally you had flames, buildings that were in flames in the background, and the reporter saying, these are, largely peaceful protests. It is like there's literally chaos going on behind her, but they're just downplaying it. And so you do see this downplaying of the chaos, but there is chaos indeed.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I mean, I think that what we've seen is really an ushering in of a culture of death, is where I put it. There's an aversion to marriage. There's an aversion to having kids. And when they do have kids, they give them over to people who are just going to pollute their minds anyway. There's an aversion to private property, like all the things that would actually destroy a society.
Right.
So the chaos is not demonstrated through mostly peaceful protests, right? It's the slow death of virtuous values over time, and that erodes a society pretty quickly. You mentioned humanism a few moments ago, and you might be interested to know Zambia's first president in the wake of just after colonialism had ended there. Zambia was a British colony. He had actually written a book. It might actually have been a couple of books on humanism, which were mandatory reading in all public schools and all of that. And he actually didn't blush about his goal with humanism. He was like, well, this is what we believe to be the moral center of all things. But he says, but it's so that we can usher in a socialist and communist order, right? And he literally admits that.
Saying the quiet parts out loud.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Saying the quiet part out loud. And I think that's actually contributed to, and by the way, he was not the only African leader who had that way of thinking. That was the norm. One of my big concerns.
Where was he trained?
Good question. I'm not sure exactly, but I know that a lot of his influence was from Russia. That's a big thing. But then there were other African leaders. I can think of Robert Mugabe, for example, who.
Nkrumah.
Yeah, exactly. Nkrumah. They were trained in some Western countries that were already teaching Marxism as a dogma. So when they got back to Africa, that's what they pushed. And we'll get into some of this later on in this conversation. But basically what you've seen is a society that has politicized envy and victimhood, and that absolutely destroys and erodes absolutely everything. People find this controversial to say, but I think there was much greater prosperity under colonial rule than there was.
Oh, certainly.
The
same is true of India.
Yeah, exactly.
When in the aftermath of Gandhi,
right?
I mean, nobody ever talks about that version of history or what happened in the aftermath.
Exactly.
We just kind of celebrate the fact that he was able to fight against British colonialism.
Exactly. And I think that what they get so wrong there is this redefinition of freedom. When that part of the world
and liberty.
And liberty, exactly. They think of it as an emancipation from whiteness. Right, as opposed to an emancipation from sin and slavery as a whole. That's where everything goes wrong. It's incredible to think about how many atrocities have been committed in the name of freedom over time. The French Revolution, right? Like that's the banner they flew, you know. One of the things that you like to touch on as well is just the influence of feminism on the Black American family. Talk to me a little bit about that. How would you synthesize what feminism has done in that regard?
Yeah, so when you look at second wave feminism, which is a continuation of the women's suffrage movement, one of the things that they were arguing in the 60s, late 60s into the 70s, was that marriage is akin to slavery. And when you juxtapose that to the trends that we were seeing, particularly in the Black community, as it relates to family formation from the end of slavery into the 1950s, you saw a lot of progress, genuine progress, that was being made through family formation. Through the family unit, you had a increase in home ownership, entrepreneurship, the whole nine. And so whenever the feminists would come along and talk about talk about marriage being akin to slavery, they were talking against misogyny and all the different things. This began to take fire specifically among Black feminists. And And you had a lot of other movements that were going on at the time. You had the free love movement, you had the hippie movement, you had gay liberation, who were working in cahoots with the feminists. And if you read their literature and if you listen to the things that they were talking about blurring the lines between male and female. They were coming after what they perceived to be traditional roles of male and female. And this kind of revolutionary spirit was in the air.
Yeah.
And I think that you can point to many aspects of the Black community that were impacted, negatively impacted by not only feminism, but the civil rights movement, the Black militant movement, and all of these other movements were working in a kind of chorus in the downfall of these movements that were going on, or in the Black community. And I think that it wasn't just feminism by its lonesome. I think that Black culture by and large, by this time, by the late 60s and early 70s, were primed to be mostly impacted by these movements. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the rhetoric that Blacks were kind of gravitating to over the course of the 60s, from the late 50s into the 60s, the rhetoric that was being touted by the civil rights leaders, there was a kind of shift that was taking place. Because when you look at how the Black community was trending from the early part of the 1900s, under the leadership of men like Booker T. Washington, who was famous for the term, cast down your bucket where you are, which means take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you, focus on family formation, on honing your craft, on worshiping God. These were the kinds of messages that Blacks were getting, and it was working to their benefit. You know what I mean? They were putting these ideas into action. But then by the time the civil rights leaders of the 60s would come along, they were really kind of preaching this kind of death rhetoric. They were complaining about racism, complaining about all the ways in which Blacks were oppressed, and they were instilling a kind of spirit of bitterness into the hearts of Blacks, to where we began to let our hands off the proverbial plow as a means of making our way in this country. And instead, we picked up the picket signs because we believed that those picket signs would give us the liberation we so sought. And we began to abandon the course laid forth by our fathers and grandfathers and began to instead adopt this new method that the civil rights leaders were putting forth. And so we moved from a trying race to a crying race. We learned to cry. We learned to beg. We learned to plead. And that became the MO of Black culture. And so by the time, second wave feminism would come into effect, this was just a new way of expressing our revolutionary spirit. And so it's such to where today, Cato Institute conducted a study in 2019 where they asked different people of different ethnic groups, which do they favor, socialism or capitalism? And Blacks were the only ethnic group in the country that had a higher view of socialism than of capitalism. I think it was 60% of Blacks had a higher view of socialism. And it wasn't a thing of where, they didn't know what the different terms mean. No. If you go back and look at how the study was conducted, the subjects were given a very elementary kind of explanation of what socialism is and what capitalism is, and they favored socialism. And I think that's thanks to years of just indoctrination and of a kind of cultural shift that took place in the 1960s. And we can point to the 1960s because you see a kind of upward trajectory, once again, from the end of slavery till around that time, to where you begin to see a kind of plummet, if you will, where we're not trending in the same direction. And what we saw happen specifically with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a kind of enshrining Black culture as a protected class. And this was kind of the death blow, more than anything that LBJ did. It was a death blow insofar, once again, that it made Blacks a protected class, but what it did is it kind of created this kind of smug disposition that a lot of Blacks walk around with today, where they can be openly racist, where they can talk openly about, I only like all things Black. And so there's that smug disposition. There's also a kind of sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
Of I'm owed this for no other reason than I breathe air.
Sure.
So you get a smug disposition, you get a sense of entitlement, and you also get out of that a kind of race paranoia.
Yeah.
Where you see racism where there is no racism, and people are just people should just have to listen to you because you're black and you come from a kind of long line of oppression, so you should all listen to me.
Vody likes to call that ethnic Gnosticism.
Yeah. Right. So ethnic Gnosticism is something that came out of this kind of being a protected class, and that's very difficult to undo. It will take, I think, several generations to undo that. Because it's reinforced by oral history. There's always a talk of the struggle. Right. Anytime you have discussions of race in the public square, it's always connected to the struggle. There's this insisting on, think about the lynchings, think about Jim Crow, think about slavery. We always want to keep that wound open because to the extent that you can put yourself forward as an oppressed person or an oppressed class, it creates the kind of currency wherein to insist upon the passing of legislation, of policies that give us more because you owe us for what you've done to us. And so I think when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was a kind of opening up of the floodgates for what would later come in the way of affirmative action, in the way of DEI, in the way of CRT, the whole gamut. And so, again, what we see as it relates to feminism is part and parcel of something larger that was going on at the time.
The reason I find that so profound is it feels like this is something that was happening almost all around the world. Civil rights movement, Civil Rights Act 1964, you say. This is around the same time that you also get these big liberation movements in other parts of the world, Africa specifically. Very similar rhetoric, very similar push when it comes to feminism. Then, of course, you get the sexual revolution also found its way there. I mean, you might find this interesting, but Zambia specifically legalized abortion in 1972. Right. This is before Roe v. Wade. Right. And part of that was just this big push. Many people like to think of post-colonialism as perhaps the first applied political mode of post-modernity. And you kind of see this trickle over time where you see a destruction of your primary institutions. And it's interesting that wherever this goes, fatherlessness is an issue. There's just all kinds of sexual licentiousness. Communism, tyranny becomes prevalent in every way. And it really does destroy societies. And it's shocking to think of what life was like less than a century ago in this country and what it's like now on that same metric. I think the first time I came across this was reading Thomas Sowell, and I just found that baffling. Like, wow, how quickly did this happen? And I think one of the things that really pushed this was public education as well. What have you seen that way? What is it about public education that's lent itself to causing all of this?
That's a good question. So when you look at the push for school integration, obviously because you had a time after the Civil War and under the Supreme Court's decision of separate but equal, where you had Negro schools and you had white schools, or colored schools and white schools. And under that setup, under that system, you still had schools that had their own kind of culture, their own kind of identity, where teachers were free to really instill values into their students. You had a lot of parental involvement that was going on. And if you look at this old footage and these old pictures of these Negro schools, you see that there were dress codes that were enforced. You see the smiling faces. You saw this kind of taking their education seriously. And then too, when you talk to Black folks who went to these segregated schools, such as I talked to many of them, and you ask them about the kind of education they received and what their educators were like, you see a standard that was enforced in terms of, taking their education seriously. And then with school integration, the reason why it was so effective was because they were harping on this grievance. They're exploiting this grievance that, isn't it a shame? Isn't it sad that Negro students can't go to school with white students? And so that was what they were able to push really hard. When the reality is you already had this kind of falling away of school segregation that was happening kind of organically at the local level. Sure, it was happening at a faster pace in some places and others, but it was only a matter of time when you would begin to see the kind of doing away with school segregation. But they were really trying to enforce it. And what they were trying to do in an underhanded way was push the centralization of education. And, a critic might say, well, Chad, you're wrong because you still have independent school districts. Like in Texas, we have independent school districts where the idea on paper is that, well, these schools are able to operate independently. Well, the reality of it is, even though that might be true on paper, that you have what you have going on is the curriculum is still coming from the top down.
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's funding attached to those curriculum. What that means is, even though nominally you're an independent school district, you're teaching curriculum that's approved by the state because those schools have their finances attached to that.
Right.
And this is happening also on the federal level as well, where you have people like, I think her name is Elizabeth Bartlow of Harvard, and her ilk, who are responsible for pushing what students should be learning. A woman who has no kids, and hopefully I'm getting her name right, Elizabeth Bartholet, a woman who has no kids, who believes that homeschooling should be illegal.
Yeah. Wow.
And they're really, pushing this kind of statist mentality into students, and it's working.
Right.
And all of this, once again, happened under this push to centralize education, to make education state-run. And that's part and parcel of this overall agenda, to, in a sense, make the electorate dependent on the expert class, dependent on the bureaucracy, believe that to the extent that one is faced with a problem, the solution to the problem should not be a practical solution based on a peer-to-peer level, but rather it should be a government solution. So we learn to look to the government first and foremost to solve our problems as opposed to, using the mind that God has given us and the limbs that God has given us to be creative enough to take care of our own issues. Exactly. And this is, after all, how the country was set up. I mean, when you look at the writings of people like, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and others, they envisioned a society where you have, genuine self-governance. But what would happen later on, under the behest of people like John Dewey, Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, and others, they believed in what was called the bewildered herd. And what that means is society as a herd are bewildered. They don't know which way is up.
Right.
They're totally incapable of self-governance. And as a result of this, we need to establish an expert class. We need to establish a bureaucracy of experts that are able to drive society, organize society in the way that they see fit for the betterment of society. You had a lot of eugenicists who came out of this ilk, and they wanted to control for population. Right. They wanted to move society in the direction that they wished it to go. And this is what always baffles me when people, when discussions are had over the ills of society, the solution that people often come up with, be they right, be they left, be they center, is, well, we just need better education.
Yeah.
So they believe education is how you solve the problem.
Exactly.
We just need to educate people. People are just ignorant. Yeah. They're not saying that part.
Right.
But this is what I think they mean to say. Yeah. People are ignorant. People are behind. People are antiquated in their thinking. People are backward in their thinking. if they got the kind of education that I think that they should have, then we will be more progressive and more sophisticated as a society. But the reality of it is, again, it all goes back to that humanism thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It all goes back to this kind of, if we are able to secularize society, if we're able to make people more progressive, then we will have our utopia. We will have our Tower of Babel, as it were.
And you know, and that's it's these kinds of things that I think reveal that what we're dealing with here is not merely another philosophy, but another religion altogether. This is aggressively antithetical to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
It presupposes a God who either doesn't exist or doesn't care. It presupposes that the goal of life, the meaning of life, is to survive and attain power, right? And I think you get guys like Darwin pushing the survival part of it, Marx, I think, pushing the power side of it. And then I suppose their solutions are revolution, you know, and that's what it is. And then this sort of like imagined utopia,
Right.
which it's like that's just weird, you know. And there's a sense in which they have succeeded,
Right.
right? Like this is
In so many ways.
in so many ways
Yeah.
they have. And the question is, how's that working for you?
Yeah.
You know,
100%.
yeah. It's destroyed society in so many ways.
Well, the reason why, because the question that you ask, how's that working for you, is an important question to ask.
Right.
But the problem is that many people aren't willing to be honest with in the answering of that question. The reason for that is because they believe that the alternative is much worse. To go back to the way things were is much worse because I mean, when they think of religion and Christianity in particular, they're always going to point to, oh, well, what about the Crusades and what about this and what about that? At least I have the freedom to do what I want to do, live how I want to live.
Yeah.
And I take the detriments of what I have over what you want as a Christian nationalist or whatever the case may be. So again, people just aren't willing to be honest in answering that question, I believe.
You're absolutely right. So Chad, we get to last year where we have a presidential election, and it seems like something's changed ever so slightly in the sense that a few more Black people voted Republican this time around. My question to you is woke dead? Is what's happened to it? Hasn't Trump expunged this thing, you know, from the public square? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I wrote an article for The Blaze shortly after the win of Trump. And the way I described it is to say that, you know, the election of Trump may be the winning of a battle, but it's certainly not the winning of a war.
Right.
Well, you look at, for example, Barack Obama, who was president from 2008 to 2016. He was someone who was very concerned about his legacy. This is a reason for the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare.
Right.
Obama saw himself as a kind of continuation of FDR, and he wanted the history books to treat him the same way that it treated FDR, insofar as explaining to our children's children that Obama was a great president, he had a great legacy, and Obamacare is a part of his great legacy.
Yeah.
And this is why it was important to him that Hillary Clinton wins the 2016 election, that Biden wins the 2020 election, and the subsequent 2024 election, which later obviously became Kamala Harris. And if you listen to his stumping on the campaign trail during those three elections, he's always talking about his legacy. He even said, I think in 2016, that it will be a threat to his legacy if this community, talking to the Blacks, if this community doesn't hunker together and flock to the polls and get Hillary into office. Because he understood in a time when Republicans were talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare, he knew that if that were to happen, that would sabotage his legacy. That will sabotage his chance of being in the history books. And so Trump would come along in 2016 and he would foil those plans by winning the election. And I believe he won the 2020 election as well, but we won't get into that. but then he would go on to win the 2024 election. But the thing about Trump is he's merely a symbol. Like when you look at his policies and you look at some of the things that he's doing as it relates to artificial intelligence and other things, like these aren't good things. I can say that objectively speaking, because I mean, I don't want to sidetrack, but anyway,
go ahead,
but comparatively speaking, he's better than his opposition.
Right.
But when it comes to wokeness, I mean, when you see the kind of uprooting of DEI and all these things, and these official positions, I think that many people see that as a victory. Many people see that as kind of wokeness being exposed in the form of DEI and the forms of race-based policies and things of this nature. And I think that's predicated somewhat on this notion, or this reality rather, that for the past 70 years, white Americans have been in a mode of flight. They've been retreating because of the approved narrative that Martin Luther King is a hero. Civil rights movement was an objectively good thing. Black people are oppressed, and now we are needing to, turn the chapter and move into a new age of progressivism. Because of a lot of the rhetoric that we've gotten through our education system, through entertainment, through the press, in this very pervasive way, in this kind of changing of the hegemony, white people have been in a state of flight. Now they're entering into a state of fight, where they're beginning to push back, where they're no longer tolerating this kind of, you have to sit down and shut up because I'm Black. I'm the oppressed one in the room. Therefore, you have to listen to me. A lot of whites are beginning to say, well, not so fast, and they're not tolerating it anymore. So to that extent, I think Trump has become a symbol that has championed this kind of new era of fight, not insofar that he is directing it or attacking it directly, but more so to the extent that he's challenging the media, which has always been, Trump's MO in the political space, like dating as early as 2015. And I would argue even before that. But, to the extent that Trump came down the golden escalator, he talked about immigration and all the things, the media was really anticipating Trump running for president, and they have been anticipating this since the 80s. But when he came and he said the things that he said, the media basically came on the attack. Now, what tends to happen when the media goes on the attack is a politician retreats. They go on the record apologizing and say, well, I didn't quite mean it that way. Trump didn't do that. He doubled down. And I think that this was very interesting for people in our generation to see, because we're used to respectability politics. We're used to a kind of decor that politicians operate under. A lot of politicians have went into oblivion for a lot less than what Trump is doing. But he kind of laid the blueprint for standing up and fighting back. And it became something that was contagious for so many people. So does this mean that wokeism is dead? I wouldn't say so, because there's a lot of people that are still under its spell. And you still see it alive and well in academia. You see it alive and well in entertainment. You see a lot of celebrities who are, in a sense, being the kind of front runners in terms of how you as society should react as it relates to racism and sexism and all the things. And so it exists on a cultural level that I think you can't just get rid of in an election. And so it's going to take a while for those tables begin to turn. And with Trump, Trump represents a political tactic. And I don't think politics is going to end wokeness. I think that can only be done spiritually.
Amen.
So I think people like Doug Wilson are more important to the end of wokeism than a politician. However, I do think that the political, I think, is helpful, but it's not the answer. And I know you're not saying that it's the answer. But it's I think that's something interesting to pay attention to.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think it's something else that gets misdiagnosed is how we got here in the first place. And I think the prevalence...
And it took years.
It did take years, yeah. we kind of accepted secular humanism as the dogma of all things. And I think all this flows downstream from that. And I'd even say, to the degree to which conservatism remains godless, you still end up where we are right now, where wokeness is the prevalent narrative in many ways. And I think it's going to take nothing less than faith and repentance in the person and work of Jesus Christ to really upend this the way that it needs to. There's a sense in which secularism is eating itself. The left aren't having kids, for example. So in a generation or two, they might be wiped out. And from that perspective, living in the consequences of their own sin. But if we're going to correct this, we need to correct this with truth. We need to bring Christianity to the fore of this, I think, to really deal with it. So,
and that's why I'm inspired by men like Vodi Bakum and others, because it's like when I look at Vodi, truth be told, because you asked me earlier about how I started out. I mean, I would say is in many ways responsible for my understanding that I can't put my children in the public schools. I can't punt the responsibility to the society. Because again, at this time, I was already looking into cultural Marxism and all the other things back in 2007, 2008. And
at the time, he was writing to warn people about Obama.
Exactly.
But people just didn't have categories for all of that.
Exactly. And so it's like, and so Vodi was one of the first people that I saw who were making it make sense to me in terms of like, if I am a believer, if I'm part of the remnant, why would I give my children, and I didn't have children at the time, but why would I give my children to a system and to a society and to a culture that's going to, in a sense, raise them up in an army against my values, against what I believe to be true. And so I think we do need to see more of that. Again, it won't be done within the political space. It will be done in the streets. It will be done, because that's the thing. Politics is downstream of culture.
Yep.
And if we're not doing anything to
and culture downstream from religion.
There you go.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So
so you featured in the films Uncle Tom 1 and 2. Did you produce them as well?
I produced part 2.
Okay, you produced part 2. Yeah.
I was just in part 1.
Okay. Yeah. Nice. And I love that you got all my friends, Virgil, Daryl, Vodi,
Yeah.
That's awesome. What kind of pushback did you get from this? Another way I could ask this is, how many times do you get called a coon when actual Uncle Tom in light of everything that you do?
Mostly online, never to my face.
Yeah.
And that's, par for the course when you're talking about these kind of issues. Yeah. But I think what I've been more impressed by are the number of people who are appreciative of
That's
the work.
amazing. Good.
I think we're living in an age of information where people are hungry for information. And they see the kind of net negative results of the way things have been under this new age of progressivism. And so when you look at the kinds of things that we're doing with Uncle Tom films, when you look at other folks in this space, I think that we're providing resources that people can look to and at least challenge themselves. I mean, I've had a lot of people who initially were hostile to the kinds of things that we were talking about, who've come back later on and said, man, this thought I couldn't get out of my head. And I began to at least do my homework to fact check what you were saying. And you were totally right. And it kind of leads them down this road to finding the truth. Amazing. And so the interaction has been mostly either positive or just outright ignored. Right. So I am appreciative of that.
Yeah.
One of the things that you've been working on recently is the MLK project. And one of the things I just love about this is I think that you are in many ways exposing an idol and trying to cut it down at the root. And it's necessary. One of the things that I think tells you a lot about a society are the kinds of heroes it upholds. Mm-hmm. And I've seen time and time again trying to sort of deify people with questionable character, but as long as they are sort of treated as these figureheads for whatever sort of liberation movement people are trying to push, they can't be criticized. They really can't be touched.
I honestly think that for as long as, for example, in Africa, tyrannical leaders are still referred to as freedom fighters, Africa will never be free. For as long as it keeps to uphold people who were honestly wicked.
Right.
If they continue to revere them as heroes, it's just never going to work out for them. So here you are, and you're bringing an axe to this narrative of MLK. Why is that so significant? Why do you think this is such an important project?
I think it's an important project because the West, by and large, are kind of under a spell, wherein you have these so-called heroes that you mentioned, who are, in a sense, helpful. These are symbols that are helpful in keeping this ruse going.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the things that disheartens me most is that many churches in America carry on as though the civil rights movement was a high point for America, as though someone like King is a patron saint that must be recognized and must be emulated and idolized. He's quoted Sunday after Sunday in many sermons across this country. And I think that he occupies a position that should only be held by Christ. Right. Because if we want to talk about race relations, there's no one better than Christ who we should look to right. when it comes to how we ought to conduct ourselves when it comes to race. We should look to the scriptures, not the supplementary counterfeit version that had an underhanded agenda to push Marxism. And so it's for that reason that it's necessary to expose who these people are, what their real agenda was, and just be confronted with the truth. What then do you do with that truth? Do you continue to latch on? Well, once I've exposed him to be a Trojan horse, do you latch on to the Trojan horse because you're mesmerized by its pretty colors? Or do you, decide this day, choose this day whom you will serve?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that we, especially the church, must contend with.
Right, right. So what's wrong with MLK? Let's get into that. What is it that people assume, and what's the actual truth about who he really is, or who he really was?
Yeah, so the narrative that we get concerning King is that he was a Christian, that he was the moral leader of the 20th century, that he brought the races together, that he confronted Jim Crow and charged and challenged America to snap out of its racial bigotry and to enter a new age of racial harmony and Christian virtue and Christian values. That's the narrative that we're given. I'm trying to stillman him. I'm hoping I'm not leaving anything out. But this idea of who King was is emphasized and highlighted by a embellished and mythologized version of American history that's not rooted in facts. That is, for all intents and purposes, just a bunch of propaganda. Does that mean that America was perfect? Absolutely not. No society is. But the reality is there's more to the story. And so in the MLK project, it started out, it was supposed to be a film. It was supposed to be a one-part documentary that became a docuseries just because there's so much information. Yeah. So we had to break it up into episodes. But when we were operating under the notion that it's going to be a documentary, it's going to be roughly 2 hours. And for the first hour, we don't really touch King. We're just laying the groundwork for American history. We're establishing what America was constitutionally, what America was before the Constitution, in terms of it being a confederation of states, where states had sovereignty. And the states actually created the federal government as a kind of mediator to keep peace between the states, more so than this overarching kind of behemoth that it became. We point out the fact that whenever the Pilgrims settled in the colonies, you did have places like Jamestown and Plymouth who implemented their own version of communism or socialism, right. A system wherein you had the kind of central hub where all the grain was stored and people were free to come and take from each according to their ability, right. to each according to their need. And so terrible was a system that within the space of 2 years, people were starving to death. Half the population was died off. People were eating shoelaces and rats. That was just the state of things until they began to scrap that system and implement a system of private property. And as a result of this, you began to see places like Jamestown bounce back quite rapidly. And so students of history, the founding fathers who, signed the Constitution, they had this kind of working knowledge of the failure that was places like Jamestown.
Right.
I say that to say that they had no intention of building a socialist society at all. Now, why is that important? That's important because, 100 or so years after the Civil War, King would invoke the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in his I Have a Dream speech, which is a speech that most people recognize King for. And he would talk about, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but as far as the Negro is concerned, the Negro still is not free. And so he's basically indicting America for not giving freedom to the Negro. So that raises the question, how then must the Negro get his freedom? That's a question that we have to answer since King put it out there that the Negro still isn't free. So I think that's worth analyzing. And when you analyze it, what you'll find in terms of answers that King gives to that question is that we must undergo a radical redistribution of economic and political power. Another thing that he advocated for, a universal basic income. Another thing he advocated for was social justice. He says social justice and progress is the absolute guarantor of riot prevention. It's the only way we can prevent riots. The only way you can prevent the Negro from taking to the streets and burning things down is by giving him social justice. Social justice is Marxist. Radical redistribution of wealth is Marxist. Universal basic income is Marxist. So what King is arguing is that the way you give the Negro his liberation is through Marxism. And he's using the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in order to, in a sense, solidify his position. Now, this isn't a reinforcement of getting back to the edicts of the Constitution. This is an outright co-option of the Constitution. So King was very slick in this way. So he wasn't some kind of patriot who wanted to uphold the Constitution. He was seeking to subvert and co-opt it. Another thing that we believe is that he was a Christian. He was a Christian pastor. If you listen to his sermons, such as I've listened to every second of every minute of every hour of sermons that are in existence that King delivered. Never once does he call people to repentance. Never once does he actually preach the gospel. Never once does he actually reference the Bible without tying it to some political legislation or some political policy. So he was an opportunist in that way. And not only that, when you look at his own writings, he didn't believe in the deity of Christ. He didn't believe in the virgin birth. He didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in the second coming of Christ. He didn't believe in the literal existence of heaven and hell.
Functional atheist, it sounds like.
Right. He didn't believe in the basic tenets of Christianity. And he wrote about these things. It wasn't as if I'm making these things up. Like, no, you can go to the 7 volumes of the King Papers that are in existence, and you can read these things for yourself. He didn't actually want to go into ministry. He wanted to be a lawyer, but he comes from a family of activists. His dad was an activist. His dad was a proponent of the social gospel, as he wrote about in his unpublished memoir. His wife was even more of a radical than he was. So he comes from a family, not only a family, but a tradition of communist activity dating as far back as the 1920s. These things were going on in Birmingham, Montgomery, Atlanta, when King was still in diapers. Wow. So he was kind of born into this tradition of communist agitation and communist activism. And when he went off to Crozer Theological Seminary, and then later Boston University, he learned about the Hegelian dialectic. Now that's important because that's what he would implement and utilize over the course of his career, where you take the synthesis of America, of tradition, and you take the antithesis of communism, and you synthesize it through nonviolent direct action, which I know you know what that means, but a lot of people probably won't.
Yeah, you can break that down.
But nonviolent direct action is interesting because what you do is you break the law in order to invoke violence against you, yourself. And to the extent that that violence is enacted against you, you then spin it to say, look, the reason this violence is enacted against me is because I want freedom and liberation. They don't want me to have freedom and liberation. We need to fight against that. And the idea is to arouse the consciousness of society to joining you in your fight to usher in a new kind of, a new society, as it were. So an example of this was one of the things that the communists were doing for a long time, since the 1920s, you see it with all white labor unions, is they would go on these strikes or they would take to the streets and march. Now, we have a First Amendment right, the freedom of speech. You can march, you can protest, you can demonstrate, you can do all those things. But we are also a law or a nation of laws and order. And you have to go through the proper protocol because we still have traffic to conduct. We still have noise to control for. We still have to have order. So you have to pull your permit if you want to do your demonstration in the streets. You can't just show up and inconvenience people, inconvenience traffic. You have to go through the proper channels. They would purposefully not pull their permits, purposefully not go through the proper channels because they wanted for the police to utilize crowd disbursement policies to the extent that they can capture that disbursement on camera, put it on the front page of the newspaper, and spin it to say, not to say that, oh, we didn't pull our permit, therefore they dispersed us, but rather they don't want us to have fair wages. That's why they dispersed us. Yeah. So these tactics were being utilized by all white labor unions in the 1920s and 30s, 40s. Right. By the time you get to the 50s and 60s, now you have television. It's a game changer. Right. So they implemented these same tactics. They showed up in the streets. They didn't pull their permits. And then, of course, the first line of action was to arrest these unruly demonstrators. To the extent that the jail filled up and they had no more space for these people, then they began to implement the dogs and the hoses and the batons. As soon as that happened, the cameras roll. Of course. And your show that you're watching, your favorite Western, gets interrupted, and you see on the screen teenagers having dogs and hoses turned on them. And that enraged society because it went all over the country, all over the world, to the extent where people were sensationalized and emotionalized into believing that something must be done about this. Yeah. And that's when you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's classic Hegelian dialectics. And other things that they would do is they would try to invoke reactionaryism from white people. Right. Irrational reactionaryism. You agitate, you poke, you prod, and you keep doing this to the extent that some irrational fella either sets fire to a church, burns down a house. Now, he's guilty for what he did. Right. I'm not, I'm in no way saying that that he's the victim in all of this, but it works in the favor of what the Marxists are ultimately trying to do. Yeah. Because to the extent that that happens, again, you put that on the front page of the newspaper. Negro church bombed by white supremacists. In a lot of cases, Negro ministers were setting fire to their own churches. This is well documented. Yeah. They were setting fire to their own houses and trying to frame white supremacy in order to arouse the consciousness of society. So you had things that were happening, some that were real, some that were hoaxes. And the idea, I believe Emmett Till was the thing that happened that was real. Again, you exploit that grievance, you exploit that situation to push your broader movement. So these are the kind of things that King would do. He was an opportunist. And not only that, when you look at a lot of the speeches that he gave, including the I Have a Dream speech, most of them weren't written by him. A lot of his books were edited and written even by some of his handlers, all of whom were communists. Whether you're talking about Stanley Levison, whether you're talking about Clarence B. Jones, Bayard Rustin, Jack Odell, and others. These were the communists who wrote a lot of the speeches that we celebrate to this very day. And so he was disingenuous in this way. Right. And it's amazing to me that so many churches and so many pastors, they celebrate King for a quote or for something he said. Yeah. And as it turns out, he didn't even really
say those things.
Well, he said them, but he didn't. They didn't. The ideas didn't originate with him.
Yeah.
And so it to me, I liken it to the fact that Satan knows the word, like he knows the scriptures, and he uses them to manipulate and to control. And that's exactly what happened, where you have communists who don't believe in God writing Christian sermons to trick Christians. Like that's something that I think we have to contend with. And so there was one more point I wanted to make, and I know I've been long-winded, but the fact of the matter is he was a facade. He was somebody who was very charming. He had a photographic memory. This is why he was able to deliver those speeches so well. Great orator. According to those who were closest to him, he was an extraordinary mimic and impersonator. He can mimic and impersonate anyone. And the fact of the matter is, if not for a pastor, I think he would have been a great actor, like a Sidney Poitier caliber actor. Yeah. And he believed wholeheartedly in the edicts of Marxism. He wrote to his then girlfriend, Coretta Scott, that, when talking about, redistribution of wealth and all these things, he said, "This is the gospel that I will preach to the world." So he was sure that Marxism was the way to get liberation.
And he did.
Yeah.
I mean, he met with Kwame Nkrumah. He met with Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia's first president as well. Several others as well. Mm-hmm. They all shared the same ideology in that sense. Yeah.
So, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, one of the things that we latch on, regardless of if you're right, left, or center, is the fact that, King wanted a better society. He envisioned a society where persons are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Even that line was lifted. It was lifted from a newspaper article written in 1872 by a Confederate journalist in South Carolina. Anybody can go to newspapers.com and find this newspaper clipping. And because the Confederates, believe it or not, many of them believed in a society where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so the idea was to take these slogans, take these symbols, take these ideas that people have resonated with over time, package them into this Negro leader, this Negro minister, in a sense to galvanize society, to neutralize society, to where we're not having the debate over states' rights versus federal authority. We'll begin to drop all those debates and just believe, because of the emotionalism, because of the times, that we need to do what this guy is trying to get us to do. We need to pass what this guy is trying to get us to pass. And so once he became a martyr, we erected a 40-foot statue of him in Washington, D.C. We made his name into a national holiday. We put him in the history books. Our children and their children learn that he was this great man, and his name is invoked each and every time Congress wants to pass more socialist legislation. And it's constantly catching Republicans in particular off their guard, because they, once you drop the name King, they subside. They retreat. And they try to find some compromise in this kind of Hegelian way to synthesize and get us that much closer to a socialist globalist society. And so it was a master play. And to circle back to your question in my long-winded way of why it's important to tell this story, I liken it to the Tower of Babel, quite frankly, because we had people who all spoke the same language, who were all trying to build this city, this tower, to usurp the authority of God. God divided the languages. And that is fascinating to me. He divided the languages. We all spoke the same language. We were all in one ungodly accord. And the language split, and we all went our merry way. I feel like right now, as it relates to King, we're all speaking the same language. We all believe the same things. We all are trying to build the socialist society, whether we realize it or not, that he envisioned. It's time now to split the languages. And not that we all go our merry way, but that we all turn to Christ.
Exactly.
Because we were trying to erect a Tower of Babel to ascend. When you look at Christ descended, and then he ascended. And in his ascension, he invites us to come along with him through his life, death, and resurrection. Absolutely. So we don't need to build a Tower of Babel. All we need to do is cast our lot with Christ.
Amen.
And I think that's the main objective of this piece.
So good. And the other thing with Tower of Babel is that you can't be fruitful and multiply doing that, right? Like you're not able to live the way God designed you to live, right? It hampers fruitfulness. And that's exactly what we're seeing with all this as well.
Right.
Yeah. So Chad, I've been in the United States for about a year now. And one of the things that people were really concerned with me moving here was this idea of systemic racism, right? and this is back in now, yeah, exactly. Like, don't you know that you're going into treacherous ground where you're going to be attacked? And of course, I mean, I can't pretend to have lived here before, but I was very aware of the arguments. Vodi's been a friend for a very long time, and so I could see through a lot of that. But when people press you on that idea of systemic racism, what's your go-to response to sort of diffuse that prevalent narrative?
It depends on the person, and it depends on what it is you're saying.
Yeah.
Because I want to talk to people,
Right.
Instead of refer to a Rolodex of sound bites, quite frankly. So it depends on what's being said. But when it comes to systemic racism, I think it's important to understand that no one is ever promised that life will be easy. Right. That misfortune is inevitable, irrespective of race, irrespective of sex, irrespective of myriad different characteristics and things. That's inevitable. And then too, if you're a Christian, we weren't promised that we would have it easy. We were promised that we will be persecuted, and that we have to keep the faith and be long suffering and stand firm. And so people who talk about systemic racism argue from this premise that life is supposed to be perfect, right. That life is supposed to be easy. Right. And I think some of that may be predicated on this idea that we are to be a more perfect union, sure. That America promises freedom and it promises welfare and all the things. But the reality of it is that that's just not the reality. My focus tends to be on what can you do, right? It's just like whenever Jesus' disciples said, "Hey, look, all these people are hungry. The hour is getting late. Let them go into the market where they can find food." He's like, "You feed them," right? Yeah. And so it's like, what can we do? If you care so much about the hungry, the wealth gap, and all the things, it's like, well, what can you do? Right. The solution is never to extort and to coerce your neighbor by way of taxes and politics, to relinquish their funds by way of the tax system, right. To people that you think are left behind or marginalized because their values aren't your values. You feed them. Right. Why don't you go start something in the private sector? Exactly. Yeah. And so the reality of it is that, systemic oppression, let me just put it this way. Systemic oppression, systemic racism. I always ask people, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by systemic racism? And one of the things, especially Black folks do, is they say, well, white people have this, white people have that. Blacks, we don't have this, we don't have that. We weren't given this, we weren't given that, we weren't given reparations. And so they believe that the way that you overturn systemic racism is by giving Black stuff. Right. And so they're operating from this notion that the government's responsibility is to be benevolent and to give people things, so to extort the taxpayer that they might give to the less fortunate, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Yeah. So this notion that systemic racism exists is predicated on the fact that we are not a socialist society, at least not absolutely. Right. And the only way to get rid of systemic racism is by enforcing and implementing a socialist society. Sure. So that's kind of where they're operating from, whether they realize it or not. And again, it comes down to pointing those things out and having the conversation and not speaking, sure. to something that they're not asking, if that makes sense.
So good. Chad, your wisdom is so valuable. I'm so grateful for you taking time out to talk with me today. I want to end with a toast, okay. And I'll let you call out the toast. What are we toasting today, Chad?
To truth.
To truth. Cheers.